Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this webinar today on privacy preserving moderation of illegal online content. This is the second session in a series of public CETaS webinars we are organizing from now until the end of the year. Our first session earlier this month explored public attitudes to national security data processing. I'm Aaron Bailey-Attias, Engagement Lead at the Center for Emerging Technology and Security, and I'll be hosting the session today. The webinar today is based on recent research carried out by CETaS. For those of you who are not familiar with CETaS, we are a research centre based within the Alan Turing Institute, the UK's National Institute for Data Science and AI. CETaS aims to strengthen UK security through pioneering research and insights on emerging technologies. Our research seeks to enable responsible innovation of emerging technologies, assess global threats and opportunities, and shape policy on high-priority security issues. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming the authors who conducted the study, which the webinar today will focus on: Sam Stockwell, Dan Sexton, and Dr Tooska Dargahi. Sam is a research associate at CETaS. His work focuses on AI's impact on online information ecosystems, including misinformation, content moderation, and election interference, as well as privacy safety challenges like biometric surveillance and encrypted communications. Previously, he worked for RAND, where he conducted defence and security research spanning military workforce issues, UK defence strategy, and emerging technologies, while leading foresight projects for the Ministry of Defence. Dan Sexton is Chief Technology Officer at the Internet Watch Foundation, IWF, and Dan leads IWF's technology, cybersecurity, and software development efforts, guiding teams building world-class tools like IntelliGrade and Report Remove to support global safety operations. With over 20 years experience spanning government, academia, and industry, Dan is deeply versed in building resilient systems and collaborating internationally across law enforcement, NGOs, and tech firms. Dr Tooska Dargahi is a senior lecturer in cybersecurity at Manchester Metropolitan University. Tooska leads the PRIZE Research Lab, that's Prize for Privacy and Security, and her work focuses on user-centric security, privacy and emerging technologies, and bridging theory with real-world cyber challenges. She brings both deep academic rigor and a passion for advancing security practices grounded in human needs. The webinar today will touch on a very timely issue, which is relating to online safety, because we know that the volume and sophistication of illegal online content are growing. In 2024, the Internet Watch Foundation confirmed at least 300,000 reports of criminal child sexual abuse imagery, a 6% increase from 2023. In this context, platforms are under increasing responsibility and pressure to protect users from online harms. But while the UK's Online Safety Act now places clear responsibilities on tech companies to remove illegal content, achieving this safely and fairly remains a major challenge, especially on end-to-end encrypted platforms. The central question we're exploring today is, how can we keep users safe online without undermining their right to privacy? The research that will be discussed today highlights that this doesn't have to be a zero-sum trade-off. It shows that privacy and security can coexist through smarter frameworks, coordinated regulation, and emerging privacy-enhancing technologies. The research also calls for stronger collaboration between government, regulators, industry, academia, and civil society to share expertise and to ensure transparency and accountability across platforms. Our speakers today will unpack these findings, explore real-world implementation challenges, and discuss how innovation can help create a safer and more privacy-respecting digital ecosystem. Before we kick off, some very brief housekeeping. The webinar today is being recorded. The video will be available on the Turing's YouTube channel at a later date. The chat function, as you will have noticed, is turned off for this webinar, but we'd encourage you to ask questions through the Q&A feature. Indeed, you are welcome to ask questions throughout the whole webinar, and they will be picked up during the Q&A segment at the end. Once again, welcome, and I'm delighted to hand over to Sam to kick us off. Sam, over to you.
Thank you very much, Aaron, for that introduction, and welcome everyone. It's great to see so many people joining us today. and interested in what I think, as Aaron has already expertly sort of reflected on, a very timely, important, but also controversial topic. And hopefully by the end of today's presentation, those of you on the call who are still there will be able to get a greater understanding of the challenges in this space, but also how we might crucially be able to progress forward with not only tackling online harms, but also in a way that is privacy preserving and cognizant of various human rights considerations. But to start with, I wanted to build on what Aaron has briefly touched on in his introduction in terms of what the problem is that we are trying to address with this research, because it's a very important one. And alongside the worrying rise in statistics around child sexual abuse material, which Aaron has already mentioned, 6.6 million UK consumers lost money to online fraud in 2024, while 4% of UK internet users had seen online content promoting suicide in the last month alone. So it's not just thinking about the harms from child sexual abuse, but also other types of content which is currently proliferating on online platforms, which can cause serious psychological and physical harm to users, whether that be around fraudulent material, suicidal content, animal cruelty, or even extremist and terrorist material. Pressure on tech companies who own many of these online platforms where these harms often occur to tackle such issues has also heated up. Back in 2023, the Online Safety Act was introduced that now places legal obligations on these platforms to try and address these issues. And under this legislation, the communications regulator, known as Ofcom, can require digital platforms to remove illegal content that is publicly posted on their sites. And in this context, we talk about illegal content in sort of the type of material that might include, for example, terrorist and violent extremist content, child sexual abuse material or CSAM, human trafficking, suicide material, as well as 15 other types of categories. And crucially, if these tech platforms, social media companies don't remove this type of material when requested, then they can face significant fines and even business disruption activities to force essentially their compliance. But unfortunately, as much as it might be easy to assume that we can just sort of tackle this issue, it's not as straightforward as that. And that's because of a variety of reasons. Firstly, there is equally significant pressure on regulators like Ofcom, but also tech companies themselves to try and tackle these illegal materials, but while doing so in a way that does not infringe on, for example, privacy rights, which are incredibly important, or equally risk worrying trends such as over-surveillance of law-abiding users. And this is particularly the case when it comes to so-called end-to-end encrypted networks and environments, which is really the focus of our research, where essentially only the sender and receiver can view messages. So in other words, when someone sends a message on one of these platforms like Signal, for example, only the sender that has sent that message and the receiver, in theory, should be able to view those messages. And the reason why it's particularly problematic to try and address these harms on those types of platforms is because there are also additional and very unique risks in trying to scan and detect illegal material without undermining those types of encryption protocols, which in many cases are vital for not only enabling the types of confidential private messaging that occurs between everyone perhaps on this call on a day-to-day basis, but also for various types of business activities as well, such as banking, where, for example, you wouldn't want sensitive credit card details or banking transaction information being made potentially public to others. And really this sort of challenge between how you address sort of both privacy and safety risks in this context was reflected in a very visible way with political developments that have been happening over the last few years. For example, when the Online Safety Act was going through Parliament back in the start of 2020s, there were intense debates over when it came to particular types of provisions that would essentially compel these types of specific end-to-end encryption services to examine the content of encrypted messages for potential harmful materials such as CSAM or child sexual abuse content. And yet, while criminals can exploit, unfortunately, the anonymity features that these services provide to evade detection when, for example, child sex offenders are trying to share this material online, there are also concerns that if we do try and better detect this material and protect users, that could also risk opening up what are often called backdoor vulnerabilities, where essentially messages could be accessed by unauthorized users and weaken both cybersecurity protections, but also privacy and sort of freedom of expression considerations and principles. Yet at the same time, moving outside of just encryption platforms, we've also seen several social media platforms and companies remove teams of experienced human moderators from their workflows. And this is around, for example, removing online sort of illegal material or harmful content that might be proliferating on public forums, like, for example, X or Facebook or Instagram. And what they've done is that they've replaced these teams of experienced human moderators with entirely automated and crowdsourced tools. And really, these decisions have divided experts and users alike, with, on the one hand, some concern that the lack of a human expert in the loop may actually sort of undermine the ability for these types of platforms to spot or to detect illegal material that might slip through the cracks, as it were, when some of these tools are scanning for certain pieces of content, because sometimes these types of detection systems are only really kind of trained on the data that they have been experienced with. They may not be able to detect new types of illegal material, particularly, for example, AI generated content that strays into illegal categories. But on the other hand, some have suggested that actually these tools and moving away from human moderators could actually help to, for example, better protect freedom of expression and free speech and reduce the risks of political bias with the use of humans in that kind of process. And really, what's been quite interesting alongside all of these debates, is that some tech companies like Meta, for example, have actually admitted that their decision to remove things like manual fact checking from their services will likely lead to more harmful content remaining on their platforms. And so, in other words, what we tend to see is that there is a real pressing need to try and address these different considerations. And within that context, what we wanted to do with this project, which was published earlier in the year, was to understand how we can better balance those different privacy and safety considerations when it comes to content moderation. And in particular, there were sort of three specific types of areas that we will be exploring today, in which the report itself explores in more detail. The first of these is around, well, what type of metrics and frameworks are out there that could help us to assess how intrusive, from a privacy perspective, these types of moderation tools that sort of scan and flag for illegal material and content on these types of platforms, how can we assess how intrusive they are from a privacy perspective? Are there already existing frameworks and metrics out there that can help us to do this? Alongside that, and coming back to some of the considerations I mentioned a minute ago, we also wanted to know what types of tools are out there that are specifically designed or can be used and sort of applicable on end-to-end encrypted environments and networks, or E2EE networks, for detecting and scanning legal content, but crucially taking into account those challenges that we mentioned around the fact that, on the one hand, there are lots of pressing needs to try and better detect legal material on these platforms, but on the other hand, doing so in a way that doesn't violate the type of encryption protocols that help to protect the confidentiality of law-abiding users and businesses. And then finally, we also wanted to look more broadly, coming back to what I said a minute ago as well, on sort of these developments with things like fact-checking and social media platforms. What types of broader strategies and frameworks can tech companies be adopting to help improve their content moderation processes more generally? And just so that everyone is sort of aware of how we're defining key concepts in this particular report and for the webinar, on the one hand, on the left, we are defining content moderation according to the definition that Ofcom, the regulator, has defined in one of their reports back in 2023. And this is around essentially activities designed to remove harmful content. And particularly in this context, we are thinking of illegal material. So that type of content that, as mentioned at the beginning, is looking at sort of those categories such as child sexual abuse material, terrorist and violent extremist content, suicidal material, and stuff like fraud as well. But also, just so that everyone is aware, when we talk about end-to-end encryption, we mean here a service where only the sender and the intended recipient of a particular message hold the keys, or in other words, the ability to unlock or decrypt that message. So in other words, only the sender and the intended recipient are assigned to see that message. And one thing that I found quite interesting when we were going through this research was trying to get a sense of how content moderation tends to work on different platforms. And really, as this diagram and workflow chart here shows, it's a very complicated and a very sort of difficult process to wrap your head around, because it often involves a lot of different stages, it involves a lot of decisions, and any one of those decisions can have potential knock-on effects and impacts for users when it comes to, for example, safety considerations, but also privacy and other types of human rights considerations as well. But to break down what really this sort of chart is showing here, there are sort of a series of steps that often happen when a piece of content is, for example, sent on a platform or a service, as well as uploaded on a content platform like social media, and sort of then how it goes through this type of moderation process. So starting from kind of the left-hand side and moving to the right, what you tend to find at the start is that you'll have some sort of pre-moderation filter, which nowadays is often automated, so kind of AI, for example, enabled tool, which will be able to identify whether a piece of content being submitted on a platform or sent to a user matches any harmful known copies of illegal material, for example, that is stored on a database that might be accessed by that platform. And it might also then go through other types of filtering as well, such as if it's a piece of text, you could do searches against banned keywords that are deemed illegal or harmful to users, and also different types of platform policies, which, if violated, mean that users are breaking those terms of service on the platform they're using. And once it goes through that sort of stage in the middle there in the red, if that content is considered safe, then it's published on the site, the sort of green arrow there, once it's gone through all of that filtering. But if it's not, there are some different decisions that could be taken. So on the one hand, it can go through the sort of top stream on the red there, where if the content has a high likelihood of being illegal or harmful or violating the platform's policies, it can be deleted, it might be blocked, or it could be altered in some way. So it could be blurred with a warning to users saying, if you view this material, it might be harmful, or it could be deranked even on the social media platform so that less users are likely to see that content. The user's account could also be blocked or reported depending on how severe that material is. And each action often depends on how confident the automated system is in terms of determining whether that material is likely to be illegal. And crucially, what can also happen is that users can appeal those decisions once they're made. So if someone thinks that that content has been incorrectly flagged as potentially illegal or harmful, or vice versa, it hasn't been correctly flagged or sort of taken down because it is illegal, users can often appeal those decisions and flag them. And what that normally means is all of those decisions tend to get taken through the orange box, where you then have human experts who've been trained in understanding where this type of content sits in terms of the law, what types of examples they've seen in the past that tends to violate platform policies, for example. They'll tend to review that material, and then they'll either make a similar decision to the automated tool if they think that that content is certainly illegal, or if it's not, they might then allow it to be then posted on the platform. But even then, the users can still appeal that decision. So it can sometimes go through multiple moderation reviews and multiple user appeals as well. But crucially, what should happen in theory is all of those decisions in the kind of black arrows there on the bottom and top left, regardless of whether the content is blocked or banned or not, should go back into the detection system at the start. So in other words, you're training the system on recent examples and cases with the aim of trying to help improve the accuracy and allow the sort of system to learn from experience, to know, for example, that if it sees similar content that's been flagged in the past, it knows more effectively what type of decision it could take based on that. And to sort of give an overview of the key findings before we go into more detail on some of the interesting observations and sort of analysis in the report that we found, there are sort of three main points that I want to sort of raise here. And I think the first one, which is really quite interesting, is that actually what we found from our research was that privacy and security protections for users, including on end-to-end encrypted networks, are actually not as incompatible as they may appear. And as we'll discuss in more detail shortly, there are actually several what are called cryptographic based moderation techniques, or in other words, tools and techniques that use very complex mathematical calculations, which can actually support the detection of illegal content whilst enhancing the preservation of the user's privacy and their messages, including on end-to-end encrypted networks. And really, at a very high level, they primarily achieve this by assisting the type of detection tools, which are essentially designed to sort of do the scanning on the platform themselves and sort of make a decision as to whether this might or might not be illegal material, to be able to do that kind of detection process, but in a way that doesn't actually reveal any information on both the user itself who sent that message or maybe reported it, but also on the contents of that message. So in other words, the only sort of information that the service provider will receive is a confirmation at the end of that detection process as to whether or not there is a high likelihood that that piece of content may or may not be illegal. And they can then decide what types of actions can be taken following that before, for example, those messages are then encrypted and allowed to be sent to the user. Secondly, we also found that the current evaluation metrics and frameworks used to assess content moderation techniques are tending to be very narrowly focused on what we call in the report technical performance metrics. And we'll get on to these more in more detail shortly. But while these existing frameworks primarily assess how accurate or quick these detection tools are, for example, spotting large volumes of illegal content amid benign or legal material that is being posted on online platforms. So, for example, how effective or quick they are and how accurate they are at sort of sifting through the haystack and finding those needles that might be, for example, pieces of illegal material within a large volume of very normal legal material. They actually also tend to neglect other vital considerations with the specific implementation of these tools on end-to-end encrypted services. So in other words, whilst these frameworks are very useful, they're not very useful when used or applied to end-to-end encrypted environments because of some of those unique risks and considerations that I mentioned earlier. And so in the report, and we'll go on to these in more detail shortly, we call for the adoption of a wider range of frameworks and metrics, essentially, such as things like data exposure metrics, cryptographic protection metrics, and adversarial resistance metrics as well. And finally, while there are promising knowledge sharing mechanisms that are trying to help understand what best practices are out there for content moderation and detection, as we'll come on to later in the presentation, these types of forums are currently very fragmented. They tend to only include a limited amount of, for example, industry members. They don't really tend to include other parts of society, such as civil society groups, academics, industry, sort of smaller industry bodies, but they also typically tend to focus on specific harm types. So in other words, what type of moderation techniques could help to tackle explicitly child sexual abuse material or, for example, terrorist and violent extremist content. And whilst that's incredibly useful, we think that there is a missed opportunity here to actually centralize a lot of this really good best practice going on in these different areas to sort of tackle multiple different harms and sort of identifying cost-effective methods that could be used by different platforms to more effectively tackle these threats in a privacy-preserving way. And with that, I will hand over to my colleague Tooska to go into more detail on some of the privacy-preserving metrics and techniques that we identified in the report that were seen as very promising in this area. So Tooska, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sam, for the comprehensive explanation. So when we are evaluating the moderation systems on end-to-end encrypted services, as Sam mentioned, we need to go beyond technical accuracy. And when we talk about privacy intrusiveness, the first dimension or the first type of metric that we would think about is data exposure, which is composed of a few kind of metrics. The first one would be the data access scope, which is how much of the user's content or metadata does the system system needs to access. So definitely narrower scope means that we will have better privacy. Processing location is the data processed locally on the device or sent to a central server. Of course, local processing reduces the exposure and privacy intrusiveness. Retention duration means how long is any data kept after moderation. Shorter retention minimizes privacy risk, of course. Access frequency means how often does the system inspect users' content, and lower frequency is less intrusive. Data minimization ratio means that if the system collects only what is strictly necessary or too much information. Data transformation level is relevant to the transformations that are applied to the data to make it less identifiable. Then we have some cryptographic protection metrics, which are, for example, encryption strength or strong encryption standards used throughout the whole process to preserve confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Zero knowledge guarantee means that can system verify compliance without revealing content, and protocol privacy leakage means that does the protocol itself leak any sensitive information at all. So these metrics help us quantify privacy impact before deploying any moderation solutions. So in the next slide, we talk about the second set of metrics, which are more focused on regulatory compliance and adversarial resistance. Under regulatory compliance, we consider inference attack resistance, which is related to if attackers are able to infer any sensitive data from the outputs. Then we have side channel leakage, which is if there are vulnerabilities through indirect data leaks, such as timing or resource usage. And then we have differential privacy guarantees, which is related to if the system adds noise to protect individual identities. And database reconstruction immunity, which means that if someone reconstructs the original data set if someone is able to reconstruct the original data set from the aggregated results. And database integrity, is the data protected against unauthorized modification or not. And then we have adversarial resistance, which looks at GDPR compliant, GDPR. Oops, sorry, I was talking the other way around. So the first ones were adversarial resistance, and now we are talking about regulatory compliance. So we are talking about GDPR alignment score, how well does the system comply with GDPR principles. We have data protection impact assessment coverage, if DPIA has been performed and documented appropriately. And then legitimate interest assessment, which is relevant to justifying the data processing under privacy law. So these metrics ensure that moderation tools are not only technically sound, but also legally and ethically what the stakeholders and industry is doing is compliant with the regulations. It's important to mention that these privacy intrusiveness metrics that we have covered in the report are one of our main contributions. When we reviewed the literature, we found that while individual metrics existed in different papers and research studies, there was no comprehensive structured framework that captures all of the dimensions. Some of them were just talking about technical accuracy, false positive, time to detect, and so on, and so on. And some of them were touching a few of these privacy metrics. But we believe that this work fills the gap, but by providing a holistic set of metrics that platforms and researchers can use to evaluate the moderation tools consistently. Then if we go to the next slide, please, we have the privacy enhancing moderation solutions. So as Sam was saying, we have some metrics and then we have some solutions that could be used in order to preserve privacy, that we can use those metrics in order to evaluate their effectiveness and the privacy preservation. So now we categorize these privacy-enhancing solutions into two categories in the context of content moderation. So we have some which are cryptographic-based methods and some which are non-cryptographic-based methods. On the cryptographic-based methods on the left-hand side, we have a category which is, for example, zero-knowledge proof. It allows verification without revealing the actual content. We have homomorphic encryption, which enables performing some analysis and computation on an encrypted data without the need to decrypt the data. We have searchable symmetric encryption, which lets the system to do some search on encrypted content, again, without decrypting it. We have private set intersection, which matches illegal content lists without revealing the user data. So all of these are providing or preserving users' privacy while letting the computation being done on the data. Then we have secure multi-party computation, which distributes the computation across several parties without the need to export and expose the raw data between different parties. Also, we have message franking, which provides accountability for abusive messages without breaking the encryption. The other promising methods on the right-hand side, some of them are AI-based methods, such as AI image-to-text moderation, which converts the images to text for easier and safer content moderation. And then federated learning trains models locally on user devices, which reduces the need to transfer the data and preserves user privacy. And we have also some other methods, such as anonymous block listing, which blocks the harmful content while it preserves anonymity without linking to the user identifiers or identities. And also we have trusted execution environments, which isolates sensitive operations in a secure hardware-based environment. So this means that we have several methods that could be used in order to ensure that privacy and safety can coexist, and they are not separate things, and we have to leave one for the other. But of course, I have to mention that these tools have their own advantages and disadvantages. For example, cryptographic methods, they are known for offering strong privacy guarantees. However, they can be computationally heavy. While methods such as federated learning, they reduce the data transfer, they preserve privacy, but they could impact the model's accuracy. It was very interesting that throughout the project, we had the opportunity to connect with some companies and academics working in this domain. And some of them are actively developing optimizations to make cryptographic tools, such as homomorphic encryption, more practical for real-world scenarios and real-world use cases, which are very interesting for this context. Some of these techniques, such as message ranking and PSI, private set intersection, are already in use by some industries. However, each tool has, as I said, some advantages and disadvantages, and therefore they are best suited for some specific scenarios. And their limitations usually can be mitigated if we have a layered approach or hybrid approaches. That's why in the report, we are encouraging further investigation into their applicability in case-by-case scenarios, as Sam will talk at the end of the session. With that, I will now hand it over to Dan to explain how these solutions can be applied in real-world moderation scenarios. Thank you.
Thank you, Tooska. I'm just going to start with talking about compatibility between content moderation systems and end-to-end encrypted communications. And end-to-end encryption is becoming an increasingly popular privacy-enhancing technology, but it's also increasingly used to share and distribute illegal content, perhaps because of that perceived lack of content moderation happening on those services. So end-to-end encryption does create some challenges for content moderation systems, specifically as to where the moderation occurs. And while there are methods of computing on encrypted data, as Tooska says in her presentation there, the simplest method really is to do the moderation before it enters that encrypted tunnel, so at the ends. So in this case would be either before the encryption or after the data is decrypted. So in this example, we show really how a very basic hash-based detection might work to prevent a known child sexual abuse image being shared in an end-to-end encrypted system. The image is hashed at the point of upload. It is checked against the known database. If there's a match on there, the image is blocked. It is not uploaded. It is not encrypted and is not sent through that end-to-end encrypted channel. And if there is no match, it's successfully uploaded, encrypted, and sent. And it really should be that simple. The privacy enhancing technologies we went through earlier can then be layered on top of this to increase privacy. But on the really basic moderation, there is no genuine incompatibility between that privacy enhancing end-to-end encryption and content moderation, we feel. But I want to go on to talk a bit about that layering method. Now, no content moderation tool is perfect, but by combining different tools in a moderation stack, you can help mitigate those weaknesses and reduce the chance of content moderation failures. So many people may be aware of this Swiss cheese model. So you're looking at the layers of this cheese where each hole in this slice represents a weakness in an individual part of the system. But by layering imperfect barriers together, you reduce the chance of content passing through each layer and prevent those failures. So the number of layers is really dependent on risk of harm and resource available to a platform. Really what you'd expect those with the highest risk and greatest resource to be applying the highest number of, all of the layers to mitigate the harm as much as possible. And at the end of that stack, what you'll have is that human reviewer. Now they'll be responsible for acting on recommendations, for the automated tooling, managing appeals. Key part of what should be a really positive reinforcement loop where learning at each layer can be fed back to earlier layers of the stack. So you're effectively plugging the holes earlier, catching content sooner, faster, and cheaper. And in this example here, what you'll see is if you're starting with the fastest, most accurate, most efficient layer, that is where we'd always recommend to start with something like a cryptographic hash-based check, extremely fast, extremely accurate. Then you move on to slightly more computational intensive, slightly higher rates of false positive, but more resilient to changes, something like fuzzy hashing or perceptual hash matching, like Microsoft's Photo DNA. Then on to descriptor-based, which again, better at identifying manipulated imagery, and then onto AI classifiers, where really you're using that to catch suspected or new or unknown content with that human moderation layer. And the key part is actually to feed that data back. So every time you are finding content, each of those layers, it's going back into all of the previous layers. So if it is this Swiss cheese model, what you're doing is you're just filling the holes in each of those layers and making them more and more effective. And that's the end of my presentation as part of the content moderation part, and I'll hand back over to Sam. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Dan and Tooska. And just to kind of whistle through the rest before we open up to Q&A, we've now spent quite a bit of time looking at the more technical aspects of the sort of content moderation landscape, and this is really just to finish with some of the more policy aspects where we think there could also be improvements before we kind of present on some of our recommendations for the report. And as I mentioned at the start, there is a lot of really great work going on in the sort of knowledge sharing aspects. So in terms of how we can best can coordinate and collaborate between different sectors who are working on tackling these issues to share what type of solutions seem to work, to understand where trends are going in terms of threat actors and those that are seeking to share illegal material. But the real problem is that, as mentioned at the start, much of these existing initiatives are often focused on very specific types of harm. And whilst that's very important because there will be natural subject matter expertise in these different types of forums, there is also a lack of a kind of multi-sector, multiple harm or cross-harm dialogue or forum to be able to share those different types of best practice and understand how they could actually help to contribute to tackling multiple harms in a cost-effective way. And so we think that there is a real gap there for a centralized knowledge hub that could help to bring different organizations together on a regular basis to access and contribute to that best practice. And another really kind of vital part of the content moderation sort of ecosystem is around what's called transparency reporting. And this is really kind of information that tends to get shared sort of by platforms to sort of regulators to better understand kind of how their processes are working, what type of harmful content is being removed, and what types of decisions were being taken in response to different pieces of material that's circulating. But despite the potential benefits that transparency reporting could offer in theory, existing practices tend to suffer from several issues. And this tends to include, for example, the fact that companies often don't tend to provide a lot of detail on sort of their practices or the types of content that they've removed, and also discrepancies on what type of metrics are used to evaluate the effectiveness of these different approaches. And really, with the introduction of the Online Safety Acts, tech companies are now also required, who fall under the scope of the legislation, to conduct what are known as risk assessments. And these are essentially designed to identify the risks associated with illegal content on their services and what safety measures they need to put in place to protect users. And although these assessments could help to hold platforms to greater accountability for their decisions, the reports are currently not required to be published. And this risks really undermining the ability for researchers, academics, and members of the public to actually scrutinize what the platforms are doing and compare the different approaches that they're using. Yet, although Ofcom doesn't necessarily provide those pieces of information to the public, the EU does actually require similar types of details through what is known as the Digital Services Act, so another type of regulation that seeks to improve online safety and transparency. And this includes, for example, a database that is allowed to be accessed by the public, the Transparency Database, which is designed to provide all types of information and detail on these different transparency reports that allow, for example, greater scrutiny and accountability on platforms. But given, for example, that Ofcom doesn't currently allow this type of data to be published in the UK with risk assessments, we think there's another missed opportunity here to provide additional comparative data that could help to compare how platforms are complying, for example, in the EU compared to the UK when it comes to different regulation. And to finish, before we kind of wrap up, in terms of the recommendations that we made for the report out of this research, they broadly fall into two categories. So one set of recommendations was sort of really targeting platforms like end-to-end encrypted services, international standard bodies, and social media companies. And the other was looking more at sort of government, law enforcement, civil society. But when it comes to the type of recommendations that we made for platforms, really at a sort of high level, many of the recommendations that we made are sort of around more testing, more experimentation, and more adoption of the various tools and frameworks which we we've proposed in the report. So that includes, for example, encouraging the use of the various privacy enhancing frameworks that Tooska mentioned earlier to better understand, for example, the privacy intrusiveness of different moderation and detection tools that are used on, for example, end-to-end encrypted platforms. And alongside that, testing some of those cryptographic solutions such as zero-knowledge proofs and private set intersection on end-to-end encrypted environments in, for example, controlled environments to understand how they might be beneficial in preserving user privacy, but also better at tackling the scale of illegal material that might be presented on these types of platforms. And also alongside that, looking at things, for example, with what Dan mentioned, at trying to encourage these types of companies to adopt a layered moderation approach that combines the most effective and scalable tools with those human experts. And then crucially as well, encouraging these types of platforms and companies to incorporate comprehensive threat modeling, because fundamentally what we tend to find is that, for example, you can often have frameworks like OWASP's Top 10, which focuses on threat modeling for security vulnerabilities, but these don't really tend to include, for example, safety or privacy vulnerabilities and concerns. So how can we adapt these existing frameworks to the content moderation context? And then looking more at the government and regulators, again, as mentioned previously, we think there is a missed opportunity at the moment to help centralize and coordinate knowledge sharing and dialogue on a cross-harms knowledge hub that could help to provide better information on best practice and help to share signals on content moderation. We also call for the UK government and Ofcom to better map what type of organisations are out there across the different online harms ecosystem. So, for example, not just looking at child sexual abuse organisations that are trying to counter these types of threats, and, for example, those countering terrorist and violent extremist content, but other types of organisations that are maybe doing work in this space, but maybe perhaps also aren't very visible in what they're doing or aren't made aware of those that could draw on best practices and insights from them. So sort of looking to map that ecosystem would be really beneficial. And as mentioned before, we also think that Ofcom should publish their online safety risk assessments that tech companies submit to them, and you sort of turn that into some sort of publicly available data repository, similar to how the EU has done this with the Digital Services Act, to better put pressure on these companies to adopt really comprehensive service safety measures, but also to allow scrutiny and accountability into how they're consistently perhaps adopting these sorts of measures. And then finally, we've also found that tech companies that own multiple services, so for example, ones that have multiple different social media platforms, or may have, for example, end-to-end encrypted services alongside social media services, there's also a need to try and ensure that they're adopting their most effective detection systems consistently across those different platforms, because what we tended to find is that it's very unevenly distributed across the multiple services they own. And of course, if that is the case, that means that threat actors and those that wish to circulate illegal material can identify the platforms which maybe have outdated or weaker detection systems in place that could then let that content slip through the cracks. And finally, to wrap up before we open to questions, I think there are three key takeaways to sort of reinforce based on what we've discussed today. So the first is, again, crucially, that privacy and safety guarantees are possible when it comes to content moderation on end-to-end encrypted networks. And in many ways, applying the privacy preserving layer for content moderation, which we've described throughout this report and in the presentation, is all about preventing censorship and surveillance. We can actually combine, as Dan said, different technologies to minimize different harms, including both privacy and safety. And this is because if you apply these technologies in the right way, you can prevent harm to user safety, but without also the risk of censorship and surveillance, given that if used in the correct way, service providers would be able to scan for this type of illegal material, but without being able to tell who sent the message or where they sent it from. The only information they receive is simply whether there is a high likelihood that a user has sent something illegal. And yet, with that being said, as Tooska has also mentioned, whilst we've identified in theory how these tools could work, more research and testing is needed on the actual system architecture designs and how they would be implemented in practice. And that's because we need to consider, for example, as Tooska mentioned, what the computational costs might be, the resources needed to add these additional privacy enhancing layers on top of existing detection systems, and whether, for example, existing end-to-end encrypted services could actually integrate them currently, or if we might need to make changes to the way they work in order to adapt them effectively. And of course, there are also important points around how we ensure accountability and scrutiny can be applied to these processes to prevent potential abuse. And finally, we think that there would be major benefits from having a forum here in the UK where more groups, more sectors could discuss these issues and identify solutions together, given how many harms, given how many human rights considerations this particular space involves. We need to be able to have more dialogue on these topics and identify where both the shared concerns are, but also where we can move forward together to identify solutions that do not disproportionately impact on both user safety and user privacy. And with that, I will open the floor, Aaron, to Q&A.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sam. We've got just over 10 minutes for Q&A, so I'll get straight in there. I'll start with one question here that I thought was quite interesting. I think you touched on it towards the end. So if there are promising techniques out there, what is preventing companies, if anything, from applying them at scale? I'm sure resourcing and cost is one of those issues. So if you could perhaps expand on this point a bit further, that would be great. And yeah, welcome also responses from Dan and Tooska.
Yeah, sure. No, I think that's a really interesting question. I'll provide a very limited sort of thought from my side, but I think Tooska and Dan probably have more knowledge here. I think from my side, I do think that the sort of implementation side is probably the hardest part because of just how much uncertainty there is over to what extent could these types of tools be integrated into existing architectures, how slower they might be in being able to sort of scan and flag this type of illegal content if they do spot it, but also the kind of costs and the computational resources as well. But Dan or Tooska, I don't know if you thought there are kind of other considerations here that might be preventing them from using these types of tools.
I mean, I'd love to be able to answer that question easily. I think it is a question we all ask. It really is. So the first thing is they are being deployed at scale. So there are examples of, for instance, the trusted execution environment that Tooska mentioned is a key feature on the embedding of chatbots and LMMs inside WhatsApp and Facebook messengers. That's using that. So they are there at scale. They're just not necessarily being used everywhere where we would want them to be used, and they're not being used on all harm types, not being necessarily used for harms, and where they are being used for harms, they're not necessarily all harm types. But actually the technology, both on the privacy enhancing technologies and the content moderation technologies, are being used at scale. I guess what we're not really seeing is the combination of the content moderation and the privacy enhancing technologies together in order to ensure you are catching harmful content, preventing that without impeding privacy. We're seeing bits of those at different places. So it appears to be quite optional, but there are definitely some good examples of where these technologies have been used at scale on these larger platforms.
I would like also to mention that, as Dan said, these techniques have been there for many years, and they have been also promoted by ICO and several other organizations. But as Sam said, some of them, and we discussed, some of them have some challenges to be deployed in real-world scenarios and in combination with content moderation. And some organizations perhaps are a little bit hesitant in kind of investigating more or understanding. I think that if there was a force, like by regulators, by governments, or by higher, people saying that you have to do this, and these are the tools that you can use, and that these are the risks, and these are the so there is a wrong perception that this specific algorithm is computationally heavy. You see, in this specific scenario, if you match it with these other techniques, it could be used for your specific scenario. I think it could facilitate their adoption, because, as I said, there is a kind of sometimes wrong perception that they are kind of too expensive or too technical and they require a lot of resources, which is the case, but it can be mitigated, or they can be optimized.
Thanks, Tooska. And also Dan and Sam for responding to that question. There are a couple more questions here in the chat. I'll ask another one here. Are there any countries or organizations the UK should learn from in this space? So Sam, you talked a little bit about transparency reporting, looking at the case of the EU. Can you perhaps expand on this as well?
Yeah, so I think I'll probably defer to Dan or Tooska on the sort of technologies, in terms of if there are certain organizations or countries that are doing very well with sort of experimenting or using them. But I think the EU is certainly trying to make more progress when it comes to better transparency over what platforms are essentially doing around content moderation, how their workflows are organized. So they have to require, for example, stating to what extent are their content moderation workflows based on automated tools, how many human moderators do they employ, and how many types of content have they removed that violates their terms of service, and for what reasons. The problem is, though, I think that even with that process, there is still a lot of inconsistency. There's still a lot of high-level descriptions that don't really provide much useful information that could be comparatively assessed among those different submissions that are made by the various tech companies. So I do think the EU is already looking at how they can make that more standardized and more accessible. But I do think that is an area where the UK could take a sort of leaf or sort of a note out of the book, in terms of, for example, we have these risk assessments that provide very useful data on what companies are doing to tackle these harms, but they're very much in the dark. We're shut out from being able to view those, and as a result, there's less perhaps pressure on the companies to want to sort of go above and beyond the legal minimum. So if we were to sort of make those transparent, obviously take into account certain considerations, ensuring that only the necessary type of information was provided, and the type of information that could actually benefit people that are sharing illegal material isn't sort of made public, there have to be considerations there. But even some of that material being publicly available, provided in some sort of data set or database, I think would go a long way in helping to sort of place that different extra sort of accountability and scrutiny on the companies to want to sort of adopt more comprehensive safety measures. But Dr Tooska, I don't know if you've sort of talks about any countries or organizations that maybe are looking more at the tools themselves and are doing kind of good work.
So I'm on the tools. I'm not sure, but certainly as far as the sort of progressing on the regulation side of it, we've had the Online Safety Act in the UK, but also there's quite a lot of other countries which are really have some very progressing quite quickly on online regulations, which will certainly touch on this. Australia, I think, is a really good example. They've been doing it for a bit longer than us, and they're slightly a little bit further ahead. The information, particularly on the transparency reporting, has been really, really interesting. That is publicly available. I'd recommend anyone visit and have a look at that. It really does. First time we've really seen some of the inside reportings from some of the bigger tech platforms, but also there's work going on. Brazil is proceeding with some regulation. Singapore, there is quite actually, we are often get quite focused on US, EU, UK, but actually there are regulations occurring and progressing all over the world. So I think it's really important to cite all those and be understanding, what works and what doesn't in other places. There is a book where everyone is sort of looking to each other to learn. This is very new territory, regulating the internet. I think there's generally globally some acceptance that its time has come to start regulation, but very uncertain as to what is going to work and what is not going to work. So it's really encouraging. There's a few countries stepping forward there, and hopefully that globally we'll start to make some good choices there.
Thanks, Sam, and thanks, Dan. Tooska, I don't know if you wanted to add to anything to that, otherwise I could ask the next question. There's a couple more questions. I think one is a very practical. Actually, since we talked about EU, I'll ask the question that just come up. Could the proposed EU centre under the CSA regulation still being negotiated become a hub for and funder of technical solutions that are effective in detecting and blocking harmful content, as well as minimising privacy breaches? Very specific question here. Who wants to take that one?
I'm happy to. I think that's a great question. Also, I think it's quite relevant to one of the earlier questions about potential areas for further research, and I'll sort of take those two together, because I think actually what we really like to see as further research is practical demonstrations of this. A lot of this is theoretical. We've seen examples of this bit of privacy enhancing technology, this content moderation, but I really would like to see actually the next step is practical demonstrations. There's nothing more compelling than proving something works in the wild. So certainly if there's further research and further funding, that is what a big priority is, actually proving these things work. And I think as the question about whether the EU Centre could be a driver for that, then yes, absolutely. I think that could be a great role for the centre, actually driving some of the technical innovations there. I think one of the issues we've got globally is we are quite reliant on the platforms that carry the risks to be the ones innovating at mitigating those risks. And the trouble is you can get your incentives wrapped up the wrong way there, and you're sort of relying on those platforms to show what's possible. It'd be great to see other demonstrations of that. And the EU Centre could absolutely be a hub. I think we're quite reliant on the National in Child Sexual Abuse, combating child sexual abuse. The National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children in the US has been really key to a lot of the efforts to deal with online harms. But I do think that having the EU equivalent there is really important. We talked a lot about sovereignty, about various things of national security in other areas. This is another case where we are very reliant on a particular American institution. And while they've been doing a fantastic job, I think it's time that the EU really had its own independence there, and had the EU Centre, I think, would be a great way of achieving that.
Sam, thanks, Dan. Sam and Tooska, do you want to add anything to that? Otherwise, I might squeeze in one last question. And Dan, I was going to save the future research one for last, but you kind of already answered that a little bit. But one quick question before you wrap up is asking, are there any types of harm that are particularly challenging to catch, and why is this? I think some of this was touched on at the beginning of the presentation.
Yeah, very quickly, I can just mention that I think we have a lot of sort of existing databases and repositories that are trying to sort of taxonomize and sort of categorize, for example, child sexual abuse material and terrorist and violent extremist content. So these are the two harms that tend to have a lot of existing data that can help with things like hashing and comparing material that arises. But I think it's some of those other harm types like fraud, suicidal material that can be a little bit more difficult in terms of identifying where that sort of content strays the sort of illegal line, and then trying to also taxonomize that is very difficult. So there's sort of less data sets on those other types of harm categories, which is also why we think that a cross harms knowledge hub would be really helpful, because even though, of course, tackling things like CSAM and terrorist and violent extremist content is extremely important, we already have some great sort of existing repositories that they're able to help us with that, and being able to broaden out the scope to other areas, I think, is kind of the next step.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sam. Unless Tooska or Dan want to add anything to that, or maybe respond to the question around future areas of research that Dan started answering, I will then draw this webinar to a close. But maybe you can have some final thoughts, thoughts to add to here.
Yeah, I would actually like to mention that as we discussed, lots of tools and techniques do exist, and governments and regulations are trying their best, of course, and we mentioned the EU and everyone, and we see that lots of things are happening, especially related to the usage of AI these days. But when we talk about content moderation and illegal content moderation, sometimes privacy is neglected. And I, as an advocate of privacy, want to mention that privacy is very important. So it is very important to consider what kind of tools can be used to both identify the harm, but at the same time preserve users' privacy. So that would be my first priority for future research, to investigate which tools can actually be used, use case-based scenarios we create, and then provide guidance on what can be used. So that would be my first option.
Thanks very much, Tooska. And I think on that end, I will draw this webinar to a close. Special thank you to Dan, Tooska and Sam for speaking at this webinar today. I also want to thank everyone for joining today. If you enjoyed the talk today, perhaps you might be interested in joining our final webinar of our series, which will focus on AI and serious online crime. That's on the 19th of November. All details are on our website. That's cetas.turing.ac.uk. And last point from me is, if you're interested in any of these issues that were discussed today, we really encourage you to sign up to join the CETaS network to stay up to date with the work and research of CETaS. It's a network of cross-disciplinary experts from people working in UK security, technology, and the policy community. Again, information on our website. Hope you enjoyed the session today, and thank you once more for joining us today. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Cheers.